Okay, here we go. Welcome. As you find your special spot on the couch and light a candle that smells of something other than ancient despair, remember that my special spot was a dusty corner of history. So, yes, take a deep breath. Once, twice, 3 times. Someone needs to calm down here, and it wasn't me. Prepare yourselves for what the narrator calls an incredible story. I call a disaster. And today? Oh, it was monumental. Great. You know the saying, curiosity killed the cat? Well, I'm not a cat, which is a shame, because they have 9 lives and I apparently only have 1 and a terrible decision-making capacity. My curiosity doesn't kill me, it just transports me to places and times where death is a much more present possibility. And it all begins, as always, in my grandmother's basement. A place that defies the laws of thermodynamics, maintaining a humid, greenhouse-like heat even in winter, and smells like a mixture of mothballs, regrets, and literally a century's worth of dust. I went down the creaky stairs, each step a protest against my existence. My grandfather's flashlight, a World War II relic that looked more like a piece of artillery, flickered as if it were having an epileptic seizure. And there it was, on top of a pile of Reader's Digest magazines from the 70s. The book, Temps Deviationum. The golden Latin title gleamed in the failing light of the flashlight, mocking me. Time deviation. What an understatement. Instruction manual for screwing up your own timeline would be more honest. I should have gone back up. I should have gone to play video games, watch a documentary about the manufacturing of paper clips, anything. But the idea of doing anything that required patience and prolonged focus gave me instant mental fatigue. And my brain, always searching for something new, for a stimulus other than boredom, whispered, "Just a peek, Ned." What could go wrong? Everything. Everything could go wrong. My previous trips were a testament to that. I opened the cracked leather cover. The smell of old papyrus and cheap magic invaded my nostrils. My fingers, stained with dust and cheese puff residue, ran across the pages until they found a new spell. The illustration showed a long, serpentine wall over mountains. It looked grand. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe it would be a tourist trip, with no plagues, no inquisitions, no having to hide from barbarians with hygiene problems. What pathetic optimism. I cleared my throat, the braces on my teeth making a small metallic click. And I read. Out loud. Because, apparently, I have a fetish for bad ideas. In tempus serpentis lapidus, ad defensionum, the stone dragon, blah blah blah. Ming. The words sounded like I was ordering a pizza in a dead language. The whirlwind began. That familiar pull on my belly button, as if the universe had hooked me with a fish hook. The air grew thick, smelling of ozone and, for some reason, ginger. The characteristic sound of a laughing goat echoed in the chaos, and yes, I stand by it, it's the sound of a laughing goat, don't question me. The colors of the basement blended into an impressionistic blur of brown and despair. And then... thud. Silence. Not the silence of the basement. A different silence. A cold, cutting, vast silence. the first shock was the temperature. I had gone from a 113-degree greenhouse to what felt like the inside of an industrial freezer. My hoodie with the holes in it, so useful seconds ago, was now just an insult to common sense. The air was so cold and thin that my first breath was a stab in the lungs. My teeth ached from the cold on the metal of my braces. Wonderful. Simply wonderful. I opened my eyes. The world was in shades of gray, ochre, and a pale, sickly blue. I was standing, or rather, huddled, on top of a windswept hill, battered by a wind that seemed to have a personal grudge against me. The wind didn't blow, it whipped, bringing with it a fine dust that scratched my eyes and tasted like, well, like ancient China. At least, I think so. Not that I had a vast repertoire of dust flavors from different dynasties. And the view, well, the view was my first great disappointment of the day. It was only 8 a.m., so the day had promise. I was expecting the wall. You know? The Great Wall of China. The one from the photos, the documentaries, the Chinese takeout boxes. A single, magnificent, continuous structure, snaking across the horizon like a sleeping stone dragon. An imperial highway of bricks stretching from sunrise to sunset. What I saw was different. It was like buying a Funko Pop online and receiving a poorly made clay figure from a 5-year-old. In front of me, in the valley, a section of wall stretched for a few miles and then simply stopped. It ended abruptly, like an interrupted sentence. Further to the right, on another mountain range, another piece of wall, visibly older, made of rammed earth and gravel, seemed to be crumbling, becoming part of the landscape again. Looking back, another stretch, more robust and with imposing watchtowers, ran along a ridge, but it too met an end, swallowed by a gorge. It wasn't one wall. It was an archipelago of walls. A collection of good defensive intentions scattered across a vast and inhospitable territory. My nerd brain, despite the cold and misery, started firing in 1,000 directions, connecting fragments of information I had read years ago. A documentary I half-watched, a paragraph in a library book, or random post on a history forum. It all came at once. Of course, Ned, you idiot, I thought, my teeth chattering. You read about this. It's not the wall, it's a system. The Great Wall of China is a name we gave it, a convenient label for one of the most chaotic and fragmented engineering works in human history. It's a group project that lasted over 2 millennia, with each participant, Reed, Dynasty, hating the previous one's work, demolishing one part and building another on top of it. What I saw before me was living proof of this. A patchwork of ambition and paranoia. That crumbling earthen wall? Probably from the Qin or Han Dynasty, built over 1,500 years ago. That more robust section, with gray, well-cut bricks? Definitely Ming. The last major update to the imperial security system. The spell mentioned Ming, so I was somewhere between the 14th and 17th centuries. Great. An era known for its openness to lanky, red-headed foreigners with metal in their mouths. The wind howled again, and I huddled deeper into my useless hoodie. The sun was a pale smudge in the sky, providing no warmth at all. The silence was profound, broken only by the wind and the distant sound of something. A rhythm. A dull, constant thud. Thump, thump, thump. It was the sound of work. A lot of work. The demystification was right there in my face. The Great Wall wasn't a monument. It was an eternal construction site. A symbol not of unity, but of a desperate attempt to isolate oneself from a scary world. And looking at the landscape, the barren mountains stretching as far as the eye could see, the desolate vastness, I could understand the sentiment. But understanding didn't warm me up. I started walking, aimlessly, just following a goat trail or something similar, heading down the hill. My thin-soled sneakers were perfect for walking in a mall. Here, every rock was a threat to my ankle. I needed to find a place to shelter from the wind, maybe get a closer look without being noticed. Being a historical ghost was my special talent. Observing, judging silently, and complaining in my head. The idea that the wall was a single, continuous entity is an almost modern invention, or romanticization. The reality was a complex defense system, with walls, forts, camps, and signal towers. It was less a wall and more a militarized border, full of holes and weak points. It was a line of defense, not an impenetrable barrier. Often, invaders simply went around it. Or bribed the guards. Because, in the end, the greatest weakness of any wall is the people who man it. And speaking of people, the rhythmic sound was getting louder. Thump. Whack. Thump. Whack. It was the sound of stone hitting stone, of wood hitting earth. And mixed with it, voices. Shouts. Short, guttural commands that the wind carried in tatters. I was approaching one of the under-construction sections. And with this proximity, a new smell joined the dust and cold. The smell of sweat. Of hundreds, maybe thousands of bodies working under excruciating strain. My stomach rumbled. I hadn't had breakfast, and my last meal had been reheated pizza the night before. The contrast between my trivial hunger and the scene that was beginning to unfold before me was uncomfortable. The Great Wall of China wasn't just a bunch of disconnected walls. It was the largest and longest construction project in history. And like every great project, it wasn't built with machines or goodwill. It was built with muscle, bone, and lives. Many, many lives. I crawled to a large rock formation that would give me good cover and a clear view of the valley below. What I saw made me forget the cold for a moment. It was a human hive. Men, in the thousands, moved like ants on a trail of misery. Some dug the earth, others carried heavy baskets of stone on their backs, climbing up steep, precarious ramps. Others, higher up the slope, were laying the enormous granite blocks and gray bricks. The scale was overwhelming. It was magnificent and at the same time terribly depressing. Every brick on that wall that would one day be photographed by tourists represented hours of inhuman labor. I was looking at the physical manifestation of an emperor's paranoia, built with the suffering of his people. Sarcasm was my defense mechanism, but it was hard to be funny in the face of this. It was raw. It was real. The wind carried the shouts of the foreman, the crack of whips. Yes, whips. Classic. No great project of antiquity would be complete without the use of a good old whip to motivate the team. The demystification of the single wall wasn't just a geographical or historical fact. It was a revelation about the nature of power. No single emperor built this. It was generations of rulers obsessed with the same idea: keep the barbarians out. But looking at the vastness of the terrain, the infinity of valleys and mountains, the whole idea seemed futile. It was like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. A very, very expensive bucket. And a very, very deadly one. I settled in behind the rock, the cold seeping back into my bones. My initial plan of a tourist trip had already gone up in smoke. Now, the plan was to survive. And observe. Because that's what I did. I was the invisible nerd in the corner of history, taking mental notes and making acid jokes so I wouldn't cry. Down below, a man stumbled. The basket of stones he was carrying on a wooden yoke over his shoulders fell, and the rocks tumbled down the slope. A foreman was on him in seconds. The whip cracked. The man didn't scream. He just flinched, and then, slowly, began to gather the stones again. Yeah. Definitely not a tourist spot. It was a work site. And looking closely, it looked much more like an open-air cemetery. And I had the terrible feeling that this wasn't just an impression. Hiding behind a rock, shivering with cold, my stomach rumbling, and watching suffering on an industrial scale might not seem like the ideal pastime for most people. But then again, most people don't have a cursed spell book in their grandmother's basement. For me, it was just another Tuesday, or Thursday, or whatever day it was in this particularly harsh dynasty. Time becomes a suggestion when you travel through it. My position was privileged, in the sense that I wasn't down there. That alone put me in a category of comfort and luxury that would make any of those men see me as a god. A red-headed god with braces and a poor choice of attire, but a god nonetheless. The rock shielded me from the worst of the wind, and gave me a panoramic view of what I could only describe as Dante's Inferno, Civil Engineering Edition. What shocked me most, after the initial shock, was the organization within the chaos. It wasn't just a mob of sufferers. There were castes, clear divisions of labor and status, visible even from a distance. My amateur historian brain, always eager to categorize the misery of others, got to work. First, there were the soldiers. They were easy to spot. They wore padded armor, perhaps with some leather or metal plates on their chests, and carried spears or short swords. They were in the minority, but their presence was felt everywhere. Some patrolled the perimeter, their eyes scanning the distant hills for Mongol threats or whatever other tribe the emperor had decided to hate that week. Others acted as foremen, supervising the work with an expression of brutal boredom. The interesting thing is that many of them also worked. They didn't just give orders, they laid bricks, carried mortar. Life on the frontier was hard for everyone. The difference is that there's probably included a slightly larger food ration and the right not to be whipped for dropping stones. Quite the privilege. I imagine their lives, torn from their villages in the south, sent to this frozen wasteland for years on end, staring north with a mixture of fear and boredom. Building a wall to protect themselves from an enemy they might never see, while the real enemy was the cold, the hunger, and the loneliness. Then came the great mass, the main body of that sad human anthill, the peasants. The conscripts. There were millions of them over the centuries. Farmers, artisans, common men who had the misfortune of being born at the wrong time and in the wrong place. They wore no uniforms. Just rags. Cotton and hemp clothes that were once functional in a rice paddy, but here, in the northern mountains, were little more than an insult to the cold. Their movements were slow, automatic. They were men exhausted to their souls. They dug, they carried, they pushed, they pulled. Their bodies were thin, but sinewy, shaped by relentless toil. What distinguished them, more than their clothes, was their expression. A void. A deep resignation that only comes when hope has been extracted from you, day after day, for so long that you don't even remember what it felt like. They were building a wall to protect an empire that saw them as disposable, that took them from their families and their lands to die on an anonymous frontier. The irony was so thick I could feel it in the air, heavier than the dust. And finally, on the lowest rung of that social ladder, were the prisoners. The criminals. And by criminals, in imperial China, the range was vast. It could be a murderer, a thief, or just a poet who wrote a verse that displeased a local official. A bureaucrat who made an accounting error. A scholar who thought the wrong thing. They were the easiest to identify. Some had shackles on their ankles, the metal scraping painfully against raw skin. Others had their faces or foreheads branded, a permanent sign of their disgrace. They were given the worst, most dangerous tasks. Carrying the heaviest stones up the steepest slopes. Working on the unstable foundations. They were, literally, the human foundation of the wall. No one cared if they lived or died. In fact, a prisoner's death was probably seen as a saving of resources. One less mouth to feed with that thin gruel I saw being distributed from large cauldrons. Watching this for hours on end, and I did watch, because I had nowhere to go and was too scared to move, had a hypnotic and nauseating effect. The constant rhythm of labor, the endless cycle of effort and exhaustion. That's when a thought, a legend I had read in some book, bubbled up in my mind and solidified into a horrible truth. The nickname. The longest cemetery on earth. It wasn't a poetic metaphor. It was a literal description. As I watched, a bamboo scaffolding, overloaded with men and bricks, groaned in protest. There was a sharp crack, like a breaking bone, that cut through the constant noise of construction. For a second, everything seemed to freeze. And then, the scaffolding gave way. Men and bricks plummeted about 30 feet. There were no cinematic screams. Just dull, sickening thuds. The reaction was what chilled me to the bone. The work stopped for maybe 10 seconds. The nearest foreman shouted some orders. 2 soldiers went down with a makeshift stretcher. The bodies, some motionless, others writhing in agony, were simply dragged to the side, out of the way. And then, the rhythm resumed. Thump. Whack. Thump. Whack. As if nothing had happened. The human machine couldn't stop for a few broken gears. They were easily replaceable. It was then that I understood. The legend says the dead were mixed into the mortar and placed inside the wall. My nerd brain knew this was largely a myth. A decomposing body would create gas pockets and organic matter that would compromise the structural integrity of the wall. The Ming engineers were brutal, but they weren't stupid. The reality, however, was no less terrible. They weren't buried in the wall. They were buried next to it. Or simply thrown into common graves, without names, without rituals, without memory. The ground I was standing on, the earth that stretched for thousands of miles along that serpentine border, was both sacred and desecrated soil. Every step was on someone's grave. A soldier, a farmer, a prisoner. It is estimated that over 1 million people died during the centuries of the wall's construction. 1 million. It's a number so large it loses meaning. I tried to visualize it. The entire population of a modern city. Imagine a city where everyone, without exception, is sentenced to work to death on a construction project and then buried at their workplace. That was the Great Wall of China. The human cost was the true foundation of that structure. The blood, sweat, and bones of countless generations. Dead from exhaustion, from accidents, from starvation during the harsh winters, from diseases that spread like wildfire in the unsanitary camps. Every granite block I saw being hoisted seemed stained with red. I remembered a documentary I watched, where the host spoke with admiration about the perseverance and vision of the Chinese emperors. Vision. What a joke. It wasn't vision, it was a bottomless pit of paranoia and ego, fueled by an inexhaustible supply of human lives. What is the life of 1 million peasants to an emperor who considers himself the son of heaven? A footnote in his dynastic records. The wind shifted and brought a new smell to me. This time, it wasn't just sweat and dust. It was the smell of food. Something was cooking. Down below, near where they were mixing the mortar, smoke was rising from a large cauldron. It was the workers' gruel. A gray, lifeless paste being served in wooden bowls. Men took a short break, squatted on the cold ground, and swallowed their ration with desperate speed, their eyes never leaving the foreman. It was the fuel for the machine. The minimum necessary to keep the bodies running for a few more hours. My stomach protested with a loud, shameful rumble. I was starving. But how could I complain about my hunger, my pathetic, comfortable life, while watching this? I had access to hot food, a soft bed, antibiotics. Those men had nothing but the next day, which would be exactly like the last, until the day there wasn't one. Sarcasm, my faithful armor, was cracking. It's easy to be cynical from a distance of centuries, reading about atrocities in an air-conditioned book. It's another thing to see the faces behind the numbers. To see humanity being ground up and transformed into a defensive structure. I looked at the wall again, at the completed section that stretched eastward. It was impressive. A feat of engineering, no doubt. Strong, imposing, durable. And I knew that parts of it would stand for more than 500 years, until my own time. But now, I couldn't see the beauty. I only saw the price. The wall wasn't made of stone and brick. It was made of stolen lifespans. It was a monument to the indifference of power. And yet, even with all the brutality, there was a strange and terrible beauty to it. The precision of the bricks. The way the wall adapted perfectly to the mountain's topography, rising and falling as if it were an organic part of the landscape. How did they achieve all this durability? How could that structure, built with primitive tools and forced labor, be so resilient? My nerd curiosity began to fight against the horror. I knew about the brutality. But what about the technique? The science behind the construction? The horror was the story of the why and the who. But what about the how? My gaze was drawn to the mortar mixing area. It was a separate, almost ritualistic operation. Men mixed lime, sand, and water in large wooden vats. But there was something else. A subtle, sweet smell, almost like cooking rice, mingled with the sour smell of the lime. And the workers' gruel was far from there. This was something else. What were they adding to the mixture? The cold was making me numb, and the hunger, delirious. But a new question had formed in my mind, a technical, specific question, almost comforting in its lack of emotion. An engineering puzzle. And to solve it, I would need to get closer. A bad, terrible, stupid idea. Exactly my kind of idea. The decision to leave the relative safety of my rock friend was not a smart decision. It was a nerd decision. And there's a fundamental difference. A smart decision aims for self-preservation. A nerd decision, especially one from a brain like mine, ignores all risks in exchange for the dopamine hit of solving a mystery. The world around you vanishes, the cold disappears, the hunger goes quiet. There is only the problem. And the need to solve it. I didn't want to know how to survive. I wanted to know what the additive in the mortar was. Priorities. My plan was a masterpiece of simplicity and stupidity. I would go down the slope, using every rock and dry bush for cover, bypass the main area of heavy labor, and approach the mixing station from the rear, where there seemed to be less supervision. It was a plan that depended on me, a 6-foot-tall red-headed guy in a hoodie with the logo of a rock band that wouldn't be formed for 500 years, going unnoticed in a sea of Ming Dynasty Chinese workers. The chances of success were, statistically, laughable. Okay, Ned, deep breath, I whispered to myself, my breath forming a small cloud of vapor in the cold air. You've been in worse. That was a lie. But self-delusion is a powerful survival tool. I began to move. Every step was calculated. The sound of my modern sneakers on the gravel sounded like thunder in the silence between the thuds of construction. I felt like a flamingo trying to infiltrate a flock of penguins. My red hair was a beacon. I pulled up my hoodie, a pathetic attempt at camouflage. Now I just looked like a hermit with bad fashion sense. As I got closer, the smells intensified. The acrid odor of unwashed sweat, the metallic smell of dried blood on the ground, the stench of makeshift latrines that the wind mercilessly carried in my direction. It was a sensory assault. The glamour of time travel, ladies and gentlemen. Pure poetry. I crouched behind a pile of gray bricks, perfectly stacked, waiting to join the great stone serpent. I touched one. It was cold, rough, heavy. Heavy with history, heavy with effort. Each of those bricks weighed about 25 pounds. And the workers carried them in baskets, 4 or 5 at a time, up steep ramps. I did some quick math in my head. It was inhuman. It was cruelty applied mathematics. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of contortions and silent prayers to whatever deity looks after anachronistic idiots, I arrived. I found a perfect spot to spy from, a gap between a large water barrel and a pile of straw sacks. I was less than 30 feet from the mortar mixing station. The sweet, starchy smell was strong here, unmistakable. There were 3 men working on the mortar. They didn't look like prisoners, they had no shackles. They were probably specialized craftsmen, or peasants with a specific task. Their movements were precise, repetitive, efficient. In a large wooden vat, they mixed lime, sand, and water with large shovels, creating a thick, gray paste. The standard mortar, used for centuries. But next to it was the source of the smell. A smaller cauldron, over a fire of embers. Inside it, a thick, white, almost translucent substance. One of the men took a bucket of this goo and, with a practiced movement, poured it into the lime and sand mixture. They then began to churn the new mixture with even more vigor. The mortar changed color, becoming slightly paler, and its texture seemed stickier, more cohesive. I watched, fascinated. What was that? The smell was so familiar. It was the smell of dessert. Specifically, the smell of the filling in mochi, that Japanese rice cake my grandmother sometimes bought at a specialty store. It was the smell of cooked sticky rice. And then, like a lightning bolt, the information connected in my brain. A forgotten footnote from an archaeology article I read online. A discovery made centuries in the future, analyzing the chemical composition of Ming Dynasty mortar. The secret ingredient was rice. Glutinous rice. The same gooey rice used to make sweets and cakes all over Asia. I almost laughed out loud. The irony was delicious, almost as much as the rice soup probably wasn't. They were building one of the greatest military structures in human history using a confectionery ingredient. My nerd brain went into overdrive, forgetting the cold, the hunger, and the danger. I knew what was happening there, chemically speaking. The traditional lime and sand mortar was effective, but it had its weaknesses. Over time, water could penetrate, and calcium carbonate crystals would grow, creating cracks and weakening the structure. It was strong, but it wasn't invincible. What the Ming engineers had discovered, through centuries of trial and error, was brilliant. Sticky rice is composed almost entirely of amylopectin, a polysaccharide, an organic polymer. When they added this rice soup to the inorganic lime mixture, they created a composite mortar. An organic-inorganic mixture. The amylopectin acted as an inhibitor. It surrounded the calcium carbonate crystals, controlling their growth and creating a much more compact and stable microstructure. Furthermore, the sticky nature of the amylopectin gave the mortar a much greater plasticity and adhesion. It essentially glued the bricks and stones together far more effectively than pure lime. The result was a mortar with far superior mechanical strength and, crucially, much higher water resistance. They had created, without knowing it, a primitive form of high-performance polymer concrete. I looked at those 3 men, performing their monotonous work, with no idea of the sophisticated science they were practicing. To them, it was just the recipe. The recipe that worked. The recipe the masters had taught. A tradition passed down from generation to generation of builders. Add the sticky rice soup. It makes the wall strong. Simple as that. It's a humbling lesson for any modern scientist. We think we've invented everything with our labs and million-dollar equipment. But there, with a cauldron, fire, and rice, they solved a materials engineering problem that would ensure their creation would last for more than half a millennium of winds, rains, and earthquakes. The wall's nickname, Changqing, means long wall. But an older, more poetic name was the Earth Dragon. And now I saw that this dragon's blood, what held it together, was this humble rice soup. The sarcasm returned in full force. Imagine a project planning meeting. Okay, everyone, we have a problem. The previous dynasty's walls are falling apart. We need something stronger to keep the horde out. What if we use the rice from dessert? Brilliant, Wang! You're promoted. Now bring me 1,000 men to die of exhaustion while they mix it. It was the perfect combination of human genius and brutality. The same culture that could compose the most delicate poetry and develop an incredibly complex cuisine could also conceive a revolutionary mortar and use it in a project that consumed human lives like they were firewood. I huddled behind the straw sacks. The smell of cooked rice was now forever associated in my mind with the sound of whips and the smell of despair. It was the smell of progress, perhaps. And progress always has a cost. In my time, the cost is privacy, data, mental sanity. In that time, the cost was more physical. It was the lives of men being cemented into history, whether they liked it or not. Watching a bit longer, I saw a crucial detail. The rice soup wasn't used in all the mortar. Only in the mortar destined to bind the main bricks, in the most important joints. The filling mortar, the stuffing of the wall, was the standard, cheaper mixture. It was resource optimization. They used the expensive, high-tech ingredient only where it was strictly necessary. Smart, efficient, and merciless. Every decision was guided by function, not comfort. I felt a pang of admiration. Not for the cruelty, but for the ingenuity. It was such an elegant, organic solution. Using a product of the land itself, a staple food, to create an impenetrable defense. There was a poetic symmetry to it. To defend the land that produces the rice with the rice itself. A guard passed a few feet from my position. My heart leaped and I held my breath, trying to merge with the straw sacks. He didn't see me. He continued his sleepy patrol, his gaze lost on the horizon. The danger was real. My curiosity was satisfied, but now I was trapped. Trapped in the middle of a Ming Dynasty construction site, hungry, cold, and with a dangerously useless knowledge about mortar additives. I needed a new plan. To get out of there. But where to? Going back to my lonely rock seemed like a step backward. Now that I was at ground level, the world of the wall was different. More intimate. More dangerous. I could see the details that were once just blurs. The worn-out tools, the faces dirty with dust and soot, the life pulsing amidst the misery. Maybe I could find a place to hide until nightfall. A watchtower under construction? An abandoned tool shed? My mind started racing, no longer focused on chemistry, but on survival. The small intellectual victory of deciphering the mortar's secret dissolved into the cold reality of my situation. I was an anachronism. An anomaly. And anomalies in authoritarian, xenophobic regimes don't usually have happy endings. I needed to move. And fast. The euphoria of a scientific discovery, no matter how small, is a potent drug. For a few glorious minutes, I wasn't a teenager lost in time. I was a reverse archaeology genius, unraveling engineering secrets with the power of observation. But euphoria, like any cheap drug, wears off quickly and leaves you with a nasty headache and a terrible reality. My reality was that I was crouched behind straw sacks, in the heart of an imperial construction project, and my appearance screamed incompetent foreign spy. My new life goal, far more pressing than understanding mortar chemistry, was to find a place to hide that wasn't so exposed. My gaze swept the area. The wall itself, the finished section, was smooth and steep, with no handholds. The slopes were full of workers. But there, about 100 yards away, was a watchtower. It wasn't finished. The walls went up about 2 stories, but the roof was still a lattice of wooden beams exposed to the sky. The windows were empty holes, and the entrance was blocked by scaffolding, but there seemed to be less activity around it. It was a blind spot in the workflow. It was perfect. Perfect for an idiot to hide in and hopefully not be found and turned into fertilizer for the emperor's rice paddies. The 100-yard journey was the longest of my life. I moved in bursts, from one pile of rubble to the next, from the shadow of one wall to another. Every time a soldier looked in my direction, my heart tried to escape through my throat. I felt like a character in a stealth video game with the difficulty set to maximum, only without the reload last save option. The smell of fear, my own cold sweat, mixed with the dust and soot in the air. I passed by a group of resting workers. They weren't talking. They just stared into the void, their empty gruel bowls in their hands. Their faces were masks of exhaustion. They were young, most my age or a little older. In another life, another time, we could have been complaining about the same teachers, liking the same things. Here, we were different species. I was a phantom observer, they were the raw material of history. I felt a pang of something that was almost guilt, but which my brain quickly coated with a protective layer of sarcasm. Nice exchange program, I thought. So many cultures to experience. Finally, I reached the base of the watchtower. The interior was dark and smelled of freshly cut wood, damp lime, and abandonment. Tools were scattered on the floor, empty buckets, coiled ropes. I climbed a precarious wooden ladder to the second floor. And there, I found my sanctuary. A dark corner, behind a pile of clay tiles waiting to be laid on the roof. I had a clear view of the entire construction site through one of the window openings, but I was completely in shadow. Invisible. I exhaled, a breath of relief that seemed to last a full minute. I was safe, at least for now. The cold was intense in here, away from the weak sun, but it was a safe cold. A cold that didn't come with the fear of being discovered. And then, I did what I do best. I observed. From this new vantage point, the dynamic of the place changed. I was no longer looking at an anonymous anthill. I was close enough to see the individuals, to witness the small routines, the little dramas of daily life on the frontier. The soldiers' lives were fascinating in their monotony. They weren't the monsters I had imagined. They were just men doing a terrible job. I saw two of them, leaning against a completed section of the wall, playing a game with small stones, much like jacks. Their laughs were short and quiet, always with an eye out for any passing officer. I saw another soldier, alone, sharpening the tip of his spear with a whetstone, his movement repetitive and meditative. He wasn't looking north, towards the land of the barbarians. He was looking south, in the direction of home. His expression was not of fear or hatred. It was of longing. Life on the wall, I realized, was not a constant battle. It was a constant wait. A war against boredom. 999 days of crushing monotony for one day of potential terror. I could relate to the boredom. My last summer, working the checkout at a convenience store, was my own version of the Great Wall of China. Less danger of Mongol invasions, but the same level of existential despair. And then I saw something I didn't expect. Women. Not many, but they were there. In an area a bit further away, which looked like a more permanent camp, some women were washing clothes in large wooden tubs. Others were helping prepare food in an open-air kitchen. They were probably officers' wives, or perhaps camp employees. They moved with a quiet resilience, their lives as bound to this place as the men's. They created a semblance of normality, of home, in the most inhospitable place in the world. A small child, wrapped in thick cloths, ran after a chicken, its laughter a crystal clear, alien sound amidst the harsh sounds of construction. That little scene of domestic life, framed by the monstrous wall and the desolate mountains, was the saddest and most beautiful thing I had ever seen. My gaze returned to the workers. As the day wore on, the pace slowed. The exhaustion was a visible weight in every movement. I saw an older man teaching a young boy how to lay a brick the right way, guiding his hands, speaking in a low, patient voice. It wasn't a shouting foreman, it was a mentor. A transfer of knowledge, of skill, amidst the brutality. Small acts of humanity flourishing in the cracks of oppression, like stubborn weeds. I didn't understand a word they were saying, of course. But body language is universal. I saw arguments, probably over the division of labor. I saw jokes, indicated by a slap on the back and a quick smile. I saw stories being told, with broad gestures, during water breaks. What were they talking about? Their families hundreds of miles away? The harvest they were missing? The stupidity of their superiors? Probably the same things people in bad jobs talk about everywhere and in every time. As I watched, the random fact machine in my head kept running. Why all this obsession? Why did the Ming Dynasty, specifically, invest so much time, money, and lives in this project? The answer, as always, was in the past. The previous dynasty, the Yuan, was not Chinese. They were Mongols. The very barbarians the wall was supposed to keep out had, in fact, ruled China for nearly a century. The Ming Dynasty was founded on a nationalist rebellion to expel the Mongols. Their entire political and cultural identity was based on being not Mongol, on being purely Chinese. The wall was not just a defensive structure. It was an ideological statement. It was a literal and figurative line drawn in the dirt. We are here, you are there. And we will never mix again. It was the largest project of xenophobia in history, etched in stone and earth across thousands of miles. It wasn't just to keep the Mongols from getting in. It was to keep China from forgetting who they were, or who they had decided they were. A monument to national trauma. The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange, pink, and purple that made the arid landscape look otherworldly. The long, golden light of the late afternoon softened the hard edges of the wall, making it look less like a scar and more like a work of art. The wind died down, and a new kind of cold, deeper and damper, began to rise from the ground. The sound of construction slowly faded. The final orders were shouted. Tools were gathered. The workday was over. The vast human machine began to disperse. The workers trudged back to their huts or tents. Fires began to be lit, small orange stars popping up in the growing darkness. The smell of burning wood and cooking food filled the air. The atmosphere changed completely. The industrial noise gave way to a human murmur. The sound of a brutal workday was replaced by the sound of a restless night's rest. From inside my dark tower, I watched the silhouettes moving around the fires. The world had shrunk to these small circles of light and warmth. The loneliness of the place was overwhelming. Each of those fires was a small island of life in an ocean of darkness and cold. And I was on my own island, even more isolated, a ghost watching other ghosts. I was hungry, I was cold, and I felt a deep melancholy. History, up close, was not a series of glorious dates and events. It was a collection of cold nights like this, full of aching bodies, empty stomachs, and longing hearts. The night fell completely. The moon, almost full, rose over the mountains, bathing the wall in a ghostly, silver light. The structure looked even more imposing at night, a true sleeping dragon, its stone scales shimmering under the starry sky. It was a terrible beauty, born of suffering and ambition. And I was trapped within it, a silent spectator in its long, unending dream. The only thing I could do was wait for dawn and hope my magic book had a return plan, because I had seen enough. Enough for a lifetime. The night in the Ming Dynasty is dark in a way my own era has forgotten how to be. Without the light pollution of cities, the sky was a spectacle of violet clarity. The stars didn't twinkle, they burned, cold and indifferent, in the black velvet of space. The Milky Way was a thick brushstroke, a river of spectral light that seemed so close I could touch it. It was the same sight the builders, the soldiers, and the prisoners saw, night after night. A beauty so vast and impersonal that, instead of inspiring, it only highlighted my own insignificance. The cold in the abandoned watchtower was a living thing. It seeped through my hoodie, my jeans, and settled in my bones. I tried to curl up in the corner, behind the pile of tiles, but it was no use. The cold came from the stone floor, from the walls, from the air I breathed. My teeth chattered in an irregular rhythm, a percussion solo for the symphony of my misery. Sleep was impossible. Every time I dozed off, a sound would startle me awake, a guard coughing on his rounds, the cry of an animal in the hills, or the sound of a man crying in his sleep somewhere down below. They were the ghosts of the wall, and I was just the newest recruit. I spent the hours in a stupor, thinking. I thought about the millions of men over the centuries who had felt this same cold, looked at these same stars, and dreamed of a warm place. I thought about the genius of the rice mortar and the stupidity of human ambition. I thought about how history is a conveyor belt of suffering, where some build walls and others, centuries later, pay to take pictures of them. The universe, I decided, has a terribly sadistic sense of humor. When the first rays of a gray, anemic sun began to paint the east, I had already made a decision. Enough. I had learned, I had seen, I had been cold enough to last 7 lifetimes. It was time to look for the eject button. It was time to find the book. But where? The book had a bad habit of appearing in inconvenient but thematically appropriate places. It wouldn't be in the middle of the construction site. It was too chaotic. It would be in a place with history. A place of reflection. Or, more likely, a dusty, forgotten place where no one would bother me while I muttered broken Latin. My mind went back to the view I had on the first day, from the top of the hill. The patchwork of walls. There were older sections, of rammed earth, that were visibly in ruins, abandoned by the Ming planners in favor of newer routes and better materials. It was there. It had to be there. A place where the layers of history met, where time was visible in the erosion of the earth. Getting down from the tower was easier than climbing up. The camp was starting to wake up, but the movement was still slow, lazy. Smoke from the breakfast fires hung in the air, and the smell of gruel again. My stomach churned with hunger and revulsion. I needed to get out of there. Keeping to the shadows, I made my way back to the outskirts of the camp and started walking west, towards a hill where I remembered seeing an old stretch of the wall. The walk was long. The landscape was brutally beautiful, with mountains unfolding in every direction. I left the Ming section behind, with its gray bricks and precise engineering, and approached the past. The difference was stark. The wall here was not made of stone. It was rammed earth, layer upon layer of earth and gravel compacted between wooden frames that had long since rotted away. It was lower, wider, and 1,000 years of wind and rain had eroded its sides, making it look less like a wall and more like a long, winding geological formation. This was the work of earlier dynasties, perhaps the Han, or even the Qin, the first great unifier. This was the prototype, the rough draft. Thousands of lives spent on a version that would one day be considered obsolete. Another layer of suffering buried under the next. I climbed the gentle slope to the crest of the old wall. The silence here was total. No workers, no guards, no sound of whips. Just the low howl of the wind. I followed the line of the ruined wall. Every few hundred yards, there were the remains of a watchtower, now little more than a mound of hardened earth with a few stubborn stones still in place. I went into one of them. The roof had collapsed centuries ago, and the interior was a circle of rubble and wind-blown sand. The weak sun lit the space, revealing the texture of the compacted earth, almost like the rings of a tree, each layer representing weeks of hard labor. And there, in a niche in the wall that might have once held a water jug or an oil lamp, it was. The book, Temps Deviationum. It was covered in a thin layer of dust, but it looked perfectly preserved. The dark leather contrasting with the yellowish earth. I didn't feel a wave of joy. Just a deep, tired relief. Like finding your car keys after searching for hours in the cold. I picked up the book. The leather cover was cold to the touch. Always so dramatic, aren't you? I said out loud to the book, my voice hoarse from disuse. Couldn't you just appear in my pocket? Did it have to be in a ruin in the middle of nowhere? The book, predictably, did not answer. I opened it to the marked page. The return spell. The Latin words seemed to mock me. I took one last deep breath of the cold, dusty air of ancient China. And I began to read. This time, there was no hesitation, no curiosity. I read the words monotonically, as if I were reading the ingredient list on a cereal box. Reverto cursum, ad punctum, blah blah blah, temporis, home, please, now. The pull on my belly button came abruptly. The howling wind was replaced by the sound of a laughing goat. The ruins of the watchtower dissolved into a whirlwind of ochre, gray, and pale blue. The cold was sucked from my bones, replaced by a wave of suffocating heat. Thud! I was on the floor of my grandmother's basement. The smell of mold and mothballs filled my nostrils. The air was so hot and humid I felt like I could chew it. The only light was from the bare bulb on the ceiling, which cast a yellowish glow on the piles of junk. The book was closed beside me, looking harmless. I lay there for a long time, the cool concrete floor a welcome sensation on my back. My body ached. My teeth ached. I was hungry, exhausted, and filthy. But I was home. I was safe. I stood up, my knees cracking in protest. I climbed the creaky stairs and opened the door. The daylight of my own time, filtering through the kitchen window, seemed strange and new. My grandmother was sitting at the table, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee. "Geez, Ned," she said, without looking up from her paper. "You look like you were hit by a truck and then mauled by a pack of badgers. Where have you been?" "In the basement," I said. My voice sounded normal. "Looking for something." She just grunted and turned the page. I went to the fridge and grabbed a carton of orange juice. The cold of the plastic, the artificial sweetness, the simple miracle of refrigeration. It felt like the most luxurious thing in the world. I drank straight from the carton, an act for which I'd normally get a scolding, but today, it felt like an inalienable right. I looked out the window. I saw the cars passing on the street, people walking with their headphones on. A life so complicated, so full of trivial stresses and problems. And yet, so incredibly easy. So peaceful. The Great Wall of China. One of humanity's greatest achievements. A project that spanned 2 millennia, cost over 1 million lives, all to create a barrier. A defense against the other. And I, a kid from another millennium, a barbarian from an unimaginable future, just showed up inside it, walked around, and left. All that rice mortar, all that suffering, all that monumental effort, and in the end, time makes it all irrelevant. History isn't an adventure. It's a reminder. A reminder of how far we've come, and how little we've changed. And sometimes, the best place to appreciate it is from very, very far away. Preferably, from the comfort of your own bed. And so ends another session of historical shock therapy, courtesy of our field historian. I hope my near hypothermia and the sight of industrial-scale suffering were relaxing for you. They're in your nest of comfort and safety. Now it's time to let your worries dissolve. After all, compared to being a human brick in a 2,000-year-long construction project, that meeting tomorrow doesn't seem so bad, does it? You're welcome for the perspective. The good news is you probably won't be conscripted to build a 13,000-mile xenophobic barrier. Probably. If you enjoy this service of putting your problems into perspective via my trauma, consider subscribing to the channel. It's the easiest way to ensure my next historical panic attack arrives fresh to you, ready to lull you into a good night's sleep. Until the next mess up.